Mike Davis, the VP of Strategic Initiatives and Partnerships for Sheltering Arms. It's part of another Insight conversation for the ATL Education Expo. Mike, thanks so much for taking your time with me today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So, Mike, you've had a really fascinating path. I sneak peeked your LinkedIn and you gave us your bio information. So you've had some really interesting stops along the way. And that's one of the reasons we're doing these conversations, is to shed light on all of the opportunities that people who are educators or care about education can get involved with or stay involved with as a career. And so I'd love for you to tell us how you got into education, especially in the Metro Atlanta area in the first place. What were those first couple of stops?
Yeah, so my journey actually began when I was in law school, and just quick story. I went to visit my college roommate. I went to Morehouse College. My roommate was at Harvard pursuing a joint degree in education and an MBA, a master's in education and an MBA. And he hosted this panel discussion on the state of public education. It was my second year of law school. I went up, and it was the first time I heard about graduation rates for Black and Brown students. It was the first time I heard about the prison industrial complex and reading scores and all that. And I was floored. And so, long story short, he challenged everybody in the room to do something meaningful with their skills and talents. And so by the time I graduated, they had started a tutoring company, and that was my first job in education. I worked with them for 3 years, then spent some time with Teach for America recruiting teachers. And then fast forward, I got into the Broad residency in urban education, worked in Charlotte Mecklenburg schools for 4 years, and then made my way to Atlanta as the chief of staff in Fulton County schools when Robert Avosa was the superintendent.
Right.
And so that's how I got here. And yeah, I've been here ever since, man.
That's awesome. So, I mean, you're not the first person with a law background to go through a similar kind of transformation that we talked to.
Sure.
I'm curious, like, what about that experience, seeing that panel when you're at Morehouse? And this was when you were in law school?
So this was actually, the panel was up at Harvard.
Right.
And I was in law school. I was in my second year of law school. So this was, I graduated from Morehouse in 97. This was February 2002. Is that right? Yeah, February 2002, this panel discussion. And I'm a product of public school. And I always knew, just generally speaking, public schools weren't doing great. But it was something about the way that he framed the issues, and some of the panelists were talking about it. And in some respects, he put a guilt trip on everybody in the room. and it just really resonated. The more I took the time to kind of think about my own journey, I'm a first generation college student. I did, by the book. I did everything the right way. I played sports. I was active in extracurricular activities, community service, more or less a straight A student. And I got accepted to Morehouse, but physically, I was able to make it to college because my dad won $2,500 in a scratch-off lottery game. And that allowed him to tune up the car so that we could drive from Wichita Falls, Texas to Atlanta, Georgia.
Wow.
And so when you sit back and think about that, and then if you go further back, as a first grader, they wanted me to repeat the first grade. My father was in the military. I started kindergarten in Spain. We moved to Texas the middle of my first grade year. And immediately they said he needs to repeat the first grade. And so, anybody that works in education, sort of the stigma and all the what that means, the long-term implications of having a student repeat a grade. And my mom rallied. My mom was no, at the time she was a stay-at-home mom. So she was no, give me the materials. I'll work with them after school. And she did. And then, magically, 3-4 years later, I'm gifted and talented. Right. And so, no, and I know, I'm not. Like, there's nothing special about me, right? I have two younger sisters that are way more talented than I am, but it was these series of like different events. Like when I look back at my journey, that made it possible for me to be here, and a lot of it was really random, right?
Right.
And so for me, it's always been like it shouldn't be random, right?
Mm.
We should be more intentional about students and what education is and so forth. And so that really resonated with me when I was at Harvard that day, and kind of hearing about, like I said, the Black and brown graduation rates and the
Right.
prison industrial complex. And so yeah, this it's shoot, like that's almost 20 years now. I've been in the game now, trying to work with this thing from different angles. So
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you put it so well. It's like you're magically termed talented and gifted, right?
yeah,
Because I mean, at that age, I got into a talented and gifted program myself when I was like in seventh grade or something. It's like, oh, I must
yeah,
have had it first through sixth grade, and just I mean, there's now you see all your friends from those years, like growing up, and everyone's talented and doing all kinds of crazy stuff. And
right,
so it's really arbitrary most of the time. But to your point, it's
yeah,
a lot of it is like and this is something that's coming up repeatedly in some of these conversations, is that um, the system itself, if you need to know how to navigate it and at least put yourself into places where opportunities pop up even.
right,
And that is one of those huge pillars behind a lot of the inequities we see, is that depending on what side of town you're on, uh, you don't have necessarily those opportunities, and also the people
yeah,
around help navigate that system. So I'm curious,
yeah,
when I'm going to jump ahead to the Broad residency, because I've heard of that
sure.
before, but I'd love for you to share with folks, what is that, and why did you do it? What'd you get out of it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Broad residency is a fellowship program, essentially a 2-year fellowship. It's really a leadership development program designed to transition people from the private sector into education.
Okay.
And so Broad is the last name of Eli Broad. He's a billionaire. Many people know him. He's the B in KB Homes. But like Eli Broad, he's a billionaire. He started this foundation, and his sort of theory of action was, in order to improve the public school system, you need better leadership, essentially. And so they had the Broad residency program, which was designed for more junior level folks, and then they had the Broad Superintendent Academy,
Right.
which was a 10-month leadership development program for high level educators, so folks that were already in the C-suite within school systems, but they also transitioned people that were in leadership positions in the private sector as well as government and military,
Mm.
and prepared them for district leadership as well. And so for me, after my time with Teach for America, um, I wanted to continue in this work. And, I think in education, we've talked about this on before, this idea that, when you work in education, a lot of folks feel like there's only like one path, right? You have to start as a teacher and you have to
Right.
do this, and then become an AP, then you become a principal, and then you go to the central office or whatever.
Right.
And so, I didn't have that path. And so, or those I didn't take that path, right? And so Broad provided the opportunity to kind of engage, and really, the way the program is set up, over the course of your 2 years, you actually get to visit 8 different school systems
Oh, wow.
and engage with leadership and those
Yeah.
school systems and talk about the issues that they're dealing with. And so the interesting thing now is, fast forward, I went through the program back in '07, '09. Now you actually get a master's in education when you finish the residency.
Oh, wow. Missed out on that. Too bad.
Right. And now the program is housed at Yale School of Management.
Oh,
And so
wow. I didn't realize
yeah,
that.
yeah. So
That's
it's pretty dope. Yeah, it's a pretty dope opportunity and program. And so yeah, for me it was really it was simple. Is like I said, I started working in tutoring companies in New York City and Detroit, and then spent some time with Teach for America. And so for me, it was like sort of the next step.
Yeah. So I mean, you've mentioned New York City, Detroit. You grew up in Texas. You mentioned Charlotte Mecklenburg. So you've been around to a bunch of different school systems and school educational experiences. I'm curious, like thinking to those different cities, is there anything that you've noticed is like usually similar, or it really depends on the region? Like, what are some of the trends that you saw through your experiences?
Yeah, like so uh, I think the biggest takeaway for me is context matters,
Hmm.
right? Uh, and then the other big thing for me, and you see this not only at the district level but at individual school level, it's all about leadership. Um, and point in case, when I was in um, Charlotte, we had a really great superintendent. His name was Pete Gorman, and Pete put in place this initiative. I forget the name of it now, but essentially he challenged like the highest performing principals in the district to take on new challenges. So oftentimes principals, you get somewhere, you kind of turn the school around, and then you're coasting, and then you,
Right.
you got your systems in place and all that. And so they created incentives for people to go to schools that were really struggling one way or another. And it was really interesting to see which people stepped up to that challenge, and then to see how quickly they were able to transform it. And when you saw like the principals that were able to go into a building and really change the culture, and then a couple of years later you see sort of that play out in terms of like academic achievement and all these other things. Like again, it was leadership, right?
Right.
So that's always been like, as I've gone from district to district, uh, you see where leadership is really strong,
Yeah.
and then you see like where it's not, and what the implications of that are. So
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think anybody who's worked in a school building can tell you, whoever your AP is, your principal is, like they
yeah,
set the tone, if nothing else, right? Like first and
right,
foremost,
right,
they set the tone. So are you waking up and walking into a building where it's a positive culture or a
right,
negative? And it's not easy, right? Being a leader of a school
yeah.
is not easy at all. But I'm curious, like, what are some of the things that you've seen from leadership positions of folks like, this is a quality of a school or a leader that usually works out and turns into positive growth for a school or district.
Yeah, like so I think one of the things that's interesting to me is, this again just based on my experience, there's really no incentive to innovate in
Mm.
education and public education.
Right.
And so where I've seen, quote unquote magic happen, you had leaders um, that were willing to try things, to do different things. You had leaders that were um, eh, everybody. I think everybody's read the Good to Great, right? And you talk about level 5 leadership or whatever. But this idea of like you have leaders that were didn't come in like they knew everything, but were willing to come in and learn and adjust based on what they found. But and uh, but they're very clear in terms of what they're trying to accomplish, right?
Mm.
But willing to adjust in terms of how you get there. And so so that I'm thinking about Pete Gorman, I'm thinking about Robert Avosa, I'm thinking about some of the principals, both in Fulton County schools where I worked, as well as Charlotte Mecklenburg schools. Like they had their systems, but when they went into a situation, they were willing to adapt, based on the context, right?
Right.
And I said that earlier, right? Like context matters, right? So you could be, like I remember going out to Denver and hearing about some of the cool stuff they were doing there around human capital, right? And if you took their playbook and came right back to Charlotte and tried to implement it, it might not work because you may not have the right talent. You may not have like there's a
Right.
host of reasons why, right? And so I think the leaders that again they were uh, you know, they had their expectations in terms of what they were trying to accomplish, but they were they were willing to sort of adjust how you got there,
Right.
willing to take chances. So
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's funny because we talk about this with students all the time. And this is why education is so fascinating, right? Because you know, we're each teacher is essentially managing and trying to grow every student in their classroom. And
mhm,
there's a meta exercise going on every day where like this the principal is trying to do the same with the teachers trying to do the same with the students. This idea of
right.
being like adaptable and understanding fundamentals, but that you also have to mold them to your surroundings, your community, your context. I think that's really powerful and important, and yet still is something that's not necessarily, I would argue, fully internalized in the public education system.
You know what? And I think the other thing that I would say as well, that for those leaders, they understood that education is a people business and is relationship driven. And I don't mean that like in a negative connotation. It's like, oh, who knows who and that sort of thing. But to your point, right? They understood that it's, you know, like as a teacher in a classroom, it's hard to get across to a student or to help a student if the student if you don't have that relationship with the student, if they're
Right.
not feeling you for whatever reason. Same thing with the principal and the teacher, same thing with the principal and the central office. Like you know, it's about relationships, and it's about, you know, relationships are built on trust and communication, right? And so
Right.
again, not everything is going to be great, but I'm going to be transparent with you. I'm going to share with you when I have information. You know, and so like the best leaders also like created, they built trust. They were able to quickly establish relationships with different stakeholder groups,
Mm.
and then leverage that to kind of move the district forward, or to move the school
Right.
forward, or to
It's,
move the
you
student
know,
forward.
you mentioned right, exactly, and this is I've been saying this to folks too about this education might be the most people centered like space there is because every day
Yes.
teachers, you know, most people go their job is they go work in an office with other adults, but their job is mostly
Right.
with on the computer and like maybe a couple people they talk to throughout the week. Whereas a teacher is every day, multiple times a day, controlling chaos of 30 to 40 variables in their room, which are children, real life human beings who all have different stories. They woke up differently that day. It's like, you know, you have to be so adaptable and resilient to just succeed in that environment. I think to your
Yes.
point, like trust has been so eroded in this space for a while. And
Big.
I'm curious why you think that is. I have my own feelings, but I'd love to hear why do you think trust is so important now and it's been kind of eroded before, perhaps?
You know, so trust, like, so I first picked up on it when I worked in Charlotte Mecklenburg schools, and you know, the first thing I took on a project where we implemented a school quality review process. So essentially, where we were sending people out to schools
Yeah, I'm
to
sure that
spend like, you know, a day, 2 days there, right? It's an evaluation, and like and you know, like people, principals aren't dummies, right? They know, they're like, what's going on here, right? And so so what was interesting is literally like that was I joined the district in August, and then we ran a pilot in September. And so the first thing I did in October, once the pilot was over, was bring everybody back in to kind of debrief. So
Mhm.
all the schools that we had visited brought the principals in, their APs if they were interested, and just asked them straight up, like, how did you find the process? What's like basically what went well, what didn't go well?
Sure.
And and again, the question that kept coming up is, well, how are y'all going to use this information? How are you going to use this information? How are
Right,
you going,
right, yeah,
right?
yeah,
And so you know, media is like, oh, okay, you know, regardless of what everybody else was saying, this is for this is formative,
yeah,
like they and um, what it brought to mind for me was like anytime you've been in a situation where um, you know, essentially like if there's been abuse or something to that effect, right? Where people like either they don't keep their promises, or you know, anytime you're in those situations, you become jaded, essentially, right? And and when you think about school systems, you know, I don't know if this is still the case. I think it is, but like your average superintendent is there for like 2.5 years, 3 years.
Yeah.
And so every time you have that leadership turnover, every time somebody new comes in, they're all saying the same things. They're all kicking the same game, right? And and after a while, you're just like, okay, here we go. I've heard this before. Sure, I'll do this. And then you get to the point where you're like, you know what? I'm not even going to pay attention to that because this too shall pass, right? And then somebody else will be back in here. And so whenever you have that churn, that constant churn, right? And I think that's, I'm talking about at the school system level, but like that's at the school level, that's at the
Right.
classroom level, right?
Right.
Like, yeah, that's in the communities,
Yeah.
right? Like, so the school principals, like the neighborhood, like all of those things, like that's what the system has been. And so it's hard to like take somebody at their word when they say they're coming in, they're going to do this and do that, and then they
Yeah.
don't, right?
Right. Right.
Um, so I think a lot of it I mean, it's human nature, right? After a while, you're just like, all right,
Yeah,
whatever.
I mean, it's funny as you said that. Literally, my story, my experiences mirrored exactly what you said. When I first went,
Yeah.
I taught in Fulton County, and I was in a department full of veteran teachers who were really fantastic individuals, solid educators, from what I
Yeah.
could tell. And but that year was also the year we were instituting Common Core, and we got a new principal. And I remember I was kind of excited about the prospect of a new leader. And I go into the first department meeting where we're talking about, and they're like, "Yeah, okay, another set of standards too. Awesome." And like
Right.
the collective eye roll was, palpable. And and I walked away from there. I was like, I even said it to them. I was like, "You guys seem a little jaded," and they're like, "Yeah, because we've been around, and this is the seventh principal in 5 years, and the fourth different set of
Yeah.
standards." And then I had the privilege of going out to lunch with a math teacher who had been teaching for 26
Mhm.
years, and
Mhm.
really just like incredible guy, and really solid teacher. And he's the kind of guy he was like, "I don't even need a textbook. I know all the problems. I know how to do them all. Like, if you just sit down, I could teach you how to do calculus." And
Yeah.
but he said the exact same thing. I was like, what's the fundamental challenge here? And he's like, everyone's just passing through, you
That's
know.
right. Yeah.
You're here for 2 years. Kids transiency is off the charts in lower income areas. I remember there was a 70% transiency rate in my school. I couldn't even
Wow.
believe that stat. But then I looked, when I first started the year, I did a diagnostic test. So I took everybody's names and scores. Midway through the
Yeah.
year, I did a follow up, and I looked at my roster. I realized half of it was different than day one. And you're right. I mean,
Yeah.
you can't build culture without stability, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
culture is built around trust, relationships, rituals, all those things. That's such a huge point.
Yeah.
I want to go back to
Yeah.
something else you said, which I've been trying to get people to realize, but I think you articulated better than I did. Is you said there's no incentive really to innovate in education. Could you say more about that?
Yeah. I mean, um, so the system is the system, right? I do I call myself an education reformer? I'll
Oh,
say this, right?
loaded
I'll
term at this point.
Yeah, right. I'll say this, right? Like this. So the school system, a lot of people say, "Oh, the school system's broken. School system's broken." It's not, right? It's doing exactly what it was designed to do,
Right.
right? And when you think about, somebody that takes like a traditional path, and you're a teacher for 3 years. If you're a superstar, right? You're a teacher for 3 years, you're an AP for 3 years, you're a principal, right? And
Right.
then you're in the district, right? And by then you're 9 years into the system. There's pension or and all retirement and all that stuff. And so it's one of those places. And you know what? And let me back up. Like this isn't just unique to like education, right? It's corporate America as well, right? When you get beyond like the original founders of a business and you
Right.
have other people that are brought in to run the business, to maintain the business, there's very little incentive for them to change the status quo, right?
Right.
It's what got them where they are. It's what kept the company that's got the company where it is. And
Yeah.
so that's why you see like in recent years, like these startups come along and just like
Right.
completely destroy like these big established companies
Yeah, I feel like you're
because
channeling some innovator's dilemma here, right? Like that combined with
yeah, right, yeah,
gymnology. You're absolutely, yeah,
right,
absolutely. Like these, once you're established as an institution and you have a track record of success by this measure of
right.
success, you don't have an incentive to go out and figure out ways
No,
to undo what you're doing,
that's
right?
right. And then think about it from sort of the individual standpoint, right? So let's say you work in the district office. Let's say you create, um, you know, I don't know, you figure out a new initiative or whatever that saves the district, $5 million,
Mhm.
right? You get a certificate and a
Honestly,
pat on the back,
that sounds nice.
right? And you keep your job, right? Like there's no,
Yeah.
so maybe you get a promotion,
Well, it's funny you
right?
said it. Like at my school, when we had, I went through 3 principals in 2 years, and I remember it was like, oh, we need incentives for teachers, so we're gonna do a teacher of the month. And at the
Yeah,
first time, I was like, what did the teacher get? A giant pencil. They got one of those giant like pencils. It's like, great. I don't know where
right,
you get that, but it's not an incentive, right?
right.
You're
And, and
absolutely
so yeah, and then I also saw this like I took some like I left the school system and I went to work for a startup and we were working and selling into school systems, and again a perfect example, right? So you have parent communication tools, and um, we were selling a parent engagement platform,
right.
and we got some interest, but it wasn't overwhelming. And I remember sitting with our CEO at the time, and he was telling me, he said, I'm not surprised because, like he said, once upon a time, there was the newest form of communication, parent engagement was the robo dialer. And so
Mhm.
essentially the robo dialer is the tool that like when school, like if they have to shut down school or something like that,
Right.
they call
Massive.
and it automatically dials to everybody in the district, right? Now, when that thing first came out, nobody was touching it. It's
Mm.
like, for what? We don't need it, right? And it wasn't until you had a tragedy, I think Columbine or something like that, and then like their uptake, like boom, skyrocketed to like 90%, over 90% of districts were now using that tool, right?
Wow.
And so
Yeah.
again, it's a school, like school systems in general just are reactive in terms
Right.
of how they bring
Right.
on new things and
Because to
try new
your
things, and
point,
for all the
like
reasons we
it's,
stated.
yeah, I mean, it's there's and as a new business owner and startup in the ed tech space, I know exactly what you're describing. We are coming in trying to make a process that exists better, but there's
Yeah,
so much aversion to change
yeah,
because, and this is my working theory right now, why this is at the school level at least. And part of it is
yeah,
incentives, right? There's not making teachers' lives like a little bit easier isn't measured anywhere really. And so it's like, okay, well, if, and then on backs of that, because we put everything on teachers, like most change comes down the pipe, ends up on the shoulders of the teacher. Like social emotional learning is the new thing, super important, great idea. Took way too long to figure that out, but
yeah,
now it's like, all right, my history teacher is also going to teach SEL, and we'll be good, right? Um,
right,
and
right,
and so the teachers, because they deal with chaos every day, they're like, being in a classroom is change on overdrive. It's constant change. So the last thing you want
constant.
is for your routines and procedures outside a classroom to also be
Yeah,
changed. And so
that's
there's,
right.
to your point, like there's very little, unless you can tie your product or your whatever your approach to the score that the school is going to be measured by.
Top of the
Otherwise, it's
line.
really
Yep.
hard to get people to start that conversation.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. And so, and again, like I said, that I'm speaking about it from like the education standpoint because that's what I know. But when you study like corporate America, it's the same thing, right? And
Yeah.
that's why like these corporate giants get their lunch eaten
Right.
by like these little scrappy startups because they're nimble, they adapt quickly, they engage with the customers, and they take chances.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I mean,
yeah,
and this goes back to kind of where we started, I think, where there's just this compliance culture because
Yeah.
that's what ultimately, like, you know,
Keeps you safe.
right, like everybody I remember I was told very early by a teacher, they were like, it's CYA here. I was like, what the hell does that mean? He's like,
Yeah.
cover your ass.
Yeah.
That's all it is. And
Well,
I was
look,
just,
I'll tell you, when I worked in the school system, um, and I'm just Fulton County Schools. When it came to interviewing candidates for different roles,
yep,
it was amazing sort of what that interview process was. It was like, here are the 5 questions. You're not allowed to ask any follow-up questions.
mhm,
Nobody discusses afterwards. You just score it, and then based on the scores, we make a decision. And it was like, huh? Like
right,
that's crazy to me. But there's a reason, right? Like, because once upon a time, people would do interviews, and as we have 3 candidates, and candidate number 3 is my favorite, candidate 1 and 2 are going to get like this set of questions, and then candidate number 3 will get,
right,
hey, how's the weather? What are you doing this weekend? Okay,
right,
great, and you're hired, right? And so to mitigate some of that, it was like, okay, we're going to go with this,
right.
you know,
Yeah,
uh,
in the spirit, it's meant
compliance.
to
And
be
so
like, yeah, in the spirit of fairness and equality, everybody needs to have the same stuff.
we're going to go.
Right. And like it's it's really fascinating to see the push and pull right now because inequity is so much more talked about today than it ever has been. And we realize that giving everybody the same thing is not giving them that doesn't result in equal opportunity, which is what we want. And so
Yeah,
I feel like we're all just constantly trying to battle that. And we put teachers, principals, all the decision makers in really tough spots because like
yeah,
you have the greatest new idea, but a principal, if even if it goes extremely well, if there's no way they're going to get recognized for it, like
yeah,
how do you do that? And I think you're absolutely right.
yeah.
And you and I speak very much the same language about innovation. So I wanna close with a question.
Sure.
Take these thoughts and kind of project them out into the future. So we ask everybody, thinking ahead to 2050, what do you think education
Yes.
should look like in about 30 years?
Oh, brother. Um,
Could be broad strokes, characteristics. Doesn't have to be like everybody's wearing a jetpack or anything.
right. So I can tell you I, I can tell you what I hope it looks like.
Yeah.
Um, but uh, the pace of change isn't fast enough for us to get to where I think it should be, right? And
Okay.
so, but I think it should be um, it should be. I think the early years should be more student centric. So I work in early learning now, and early learning is very student centric. I
Mm,
think the first, you know, 3 to 5 years of K-12 should be more student centric. I think as students kind of get into that middle school, it becomes more like I hate testing. I don't think testing really measures anything. I think that or it measures something. It doesn't tell the story of the
right.
student
Right.
and what their gifts, their strengths, and all of that, right? And so I think like middle schools, you should start kind of figuring out or providing opportunities for students to explore different things. Like it should be all about exposure. And then I think by high school, it should be an opportunity for students to really double down on their strengths and their interests, right? And a lot of this, I'll go back like 5 years ago, like when Prince died. Um, I after he died, I remember reading a bunch of different articles about him, and I think Prince dropped out in middle school.
Oh wow.
And yet he's like this musical genius, like
Right.
taught himself to play all of these different instruments,
Sure.
got into the music industry and sort of kind of did it his way and kind of learned the business and did it his way, right? And I thought about that. I was like, wow, so what if high school was a place where like a Prince Rogers Nelson could like show up day in and day out and learn the things that he needs to learn in order to be successful on his journey, right?
Right.
And so, I have a friend, Michaela. Streeter. She has a school called the Life School,
Yep.
and it's a
They're
progressive high
one
school.
of the partners at the expo.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I love the idea of her school, in that it's an opportunity for students to really focus on their strengths and their interests. And so, she's had students that have started their own e-commerce sites, students that are investing in restaurants, and to me, like those are the types of experiences, and especially if I was at college, I want interesting kids like that on my campus doing things, and so all of that to say, like, my hope is that, in 30 years, if not way sooner, that education becomes about, like, there's a quote from Pedagogy of the Oppressed, like in the foreword of it, where it basically talks about education can either function as the means by which we essentially push students into conforming to the status quo, or it can be the means by which we liberate students to be critical and to improve the status quo, right? And I, like, me, that's what education should be. I don't know exactly what that looks like and so forth, but like I want to empower children and students so that when they enter the world, they're not just conforming,
Right.
but they're actually critical and like improving upon what already is out there, or
Yeah.
creating new.
Yeah.
That's what I think. Yeah, and there's a whole nother conversation where you start talking about equity as it relates to how that happens. And
Right.
one of the things I'm excited about that we're exploring in the early learning space is, what happens if you create an equitable early learning experience for students, and specifically for Black and Brown students, a space where, like, Black and Brown students, like from a policy and practice standpoint, are centered. I went to an HBCU, and the thing about the one I went to in particular, Morehouse, is that it's a place where Black men and boys are loved, embraced,
Right.
and nurtured. And so, what would happen if you provided that to students earlier?
Yeah.
Like, because I can tell you, I came out of Morehouse, and people always joke, you can tell a Morehouse man, but you can't tell them much, right? This idea that they're conceited, arrogant, or whatever. But for most of us, it's just a confidence that we have in ourselves.
Right.
And when the person knows who they are and they're confident in themselves, you can literally drop them anywhere, and they don't skip a beat because they're sure of who they are, right? And so the second part of what I was saying is, like, 2050 education should be like those two things, right? That equity and, like, that nourishing, that nurturing, all the SEL stuff, and then it should be like, I'm able to focus on what I'm interested in. I want to become a master at this thing, so allow me to pursue that.
Yeah. No,
So
I love that. That's great. Well, fantastic. I'm definitely going to want to continue this conversation offline sometime, but thank you so much. This has been Mike Davis, VP of Strategic Initiatives and Partnerships with Sheltering Arms, but has jumped all over the map within education, a lot of different experiences. Really appreciate you taking the time and sharing your thoughts with us.
appreciate you, Ian. Thanks a lot, man.
All right, we'll see you.